The Glass Eye of Widow's Rock, Part 1, The Contract. The ocean does not like to be watched, and that was the first thought that entered my mind as the small fishing trawler struggled against the massive swell of the Atlantic, revealing the jagged silhouette of the lighthouse against a sky that looked like a fresh bruise. They called the place Widow's Rock, which was nothing more than a sharp tooth of black granite jutting out of the cold water about 20 miles off the coast of Maine. Sitting on top of that rock like a hungry vulture waiting for the world to end was the lighthouse itself. It was not the kind of lighthouse you see on a postcard with white paint and a friendly red roof. Instead, it was a monolith of dark iron and weathered gray stone that had been stained by 100 years of salt and misery and storms. My name is Arthur Penhaligon, and I have spent my life as a specialist in antique optics because I have a talent for restoring the things the rest of the world has forgotten how to fix or simply lost the patience to care for. I had been hired by a mysterious group known only as a private historical society to spend exactly 30 days on that godforsaken rock with the specific instruction to repair the Great Fresnel lens at the top of the tower. They claimed the mechanism had jammed and the rotation gears were stripped from lack of maintenance. But they conveniently failed to mention why the previous keeper had lost his mind and thrown himself into the freezing sea below, leaving the light dark for months. The boat captain was a man named Mr. O'Malley, who looked as if he were made of old leather and tobacco. He spat a stream of dark juice into the waves as he throttled down the engine near the rusted iron ladder that was bolted directly into the granite face of the rock. He shouted over the roar of the gale that this was as close as he was willing to get because the tide was turning, and if he moved an inch closer, the rock would tear the hull of his boat to pieces without a second thought. I threw my heavy duffel bag toward the slippery landing and grabbed my tool case, which was weighted down by brass wrenches and specialized polishing compounds. I timed my jump perfectly to land on the whetstone with my boots skidding through thick layers of black seaweed. Oh, Malley screamed that he would return in 30 days, but he refused to look me in the eye because his gaze was fixed on the lantern room at the peak of the tower with an expression of pure dread. He warned me to keep the curtains drawn during the daylight hours, and he told me that whatever I did, I must never look directly into the prism when the rotation began. I tried to ask him about the generator and how I was supposed to provide power to the lamp, but he only laughed, a sound that was dry and hollow like wind blowing through an empty skull. He told me there was no generator and that the device was an oil burner, but warned me that it was very picky about what it burned. With that final ominous word, he gunned the engine and the trawler turned sharply to flee back toward the mainland, leaving behind a wake of white foam that looked like a long scar on the surface of the dark water. I stood there alone as the silence of the ocean began to press against my ears, and I looked up at the tower, which loomed over me, reaching 100 feet into the darkening sky, where the glass of the lantern room reflected the moving clouds like a giant unblinking eye that was watching the horizon for a ship that would never arrive. I made my way up the winding stone path to the heavy steel door at the base and found it was unlocked, so I pushed it open and listened to the hinges scream in protest as if they had not been moved in decades. The interior of the lighthouse did not smell like the sea, but instead carried the scent of old copper and heavy whale oil mixed with a strange metallic sweetness that reminded me of dried plums, or perhaps something far more organic. I called out a greeting to see if anyone was lingering in the shadows, but my voice only traveled up the spiral staircase, echoing again and again until the word hello sounded like a stranger was mocking me from the heights. I reached back and locked the door, and the sound of that heavy iron bolt sliding home felt as final as the closing of a coffin lid, and I knew I was truly trapped with my own thoughts. I began the long ascent of the 144 steps, and I counted every single one of them in my head as I climbed higher into the heart of the iron spiral, while the air became thick and my legs began to throb with a dull heat. By the time I reached the service room situated just below the lantern room, I was gasping for air, and the small circular chamber felt cramped and oppressive. It contained a single desk, a narrow cot, a small potbelly stove, and a logbook that had been left open on the table. I walked over to the desk and saw the pages were yellow and brittle from the dampness of the salt air. My eyes fell upon the final entry written by the man who had been here before me. There was no date provided, only a frantic scrawl in black ink that looked like it had been written by a hand that could not stop shaking. The text stated that the light was hungry and that he had given it every drop of oil and kerosene in the building, but it did not want conventional fuel. It wanted to see, and it wanted to show him what was lurking beneath the waves until he could no longer bear the sight and decided to seek peace among the rocks. I closed the book with a snap and tried to tell myself it was merely a case of isolation, psychosis, brought on by too much time alone with the wind, because I considered myself a man of logic and reason who understood the laws of physics and the behavior of light. I had no room in my mind for stories of hungry lamps or sentient glass. I climbed the final short ladder and entered the lantern room where the great lens stood in all its magnificent glory as a beehive of glass and brass standing over 12 feet tall, with hundreds of hand-cut prisms arranged in perfect concentric circles designed to capture the tiny flicker of a flame and magnify it 1,000 times to send a warning beam 20 miles out into the void. But as I moved closer, I realized something was fundamentally wrong with the glass. Every Fresnel lens I had ever seen was clear or perhaps slightly green from the iron content, but this glass was distinctly red with a rose-colored tint, as if the silica had been mixed with wine or something darker during the cooling process. I set down my tool bag as the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the world began to bleed purple and orange. I knew I had to get the light functioning before the total darkness of the Atlantic took hold of the rock. I checked the reservoir at the base of the lamp and found it was completely empty, so I located a canister in the corner marked simply as fuel. When I unscrewed the cap, the smell that drifted out was rich and iron-heavy and entirely unfamiliar to my nose, as it did not resemble any fuel I had ever encountered. I poured the thick, dark liquid into the reservoir and struck a match to touch the flame to the wick. But nothing happened. The wick simply blackened and the flames sputtered out into a thin trail of smoke. I tried a second time and then a third until frustration began to boil in my chest and I reached for a heavy brass wrench to adjust the flow valve. The metal was slick with condensation and my grip slipped, causing the sharp edge of the tool to slice a deep gash across the palm of my hand. I hissed through my teeth in sudden pain and dropped the wrench, which clattered loudly against the floor while bright red blood welled up from the cut. A single heavy drop fell from my hand and landed directly onto the unlit wick. The reaction was so fast it nearly knocked me off my feet as the lamp roared into a tower of brilliant white fire that was so intense it felt like it was peeling the skin from my face. The massive gears at the base of the lens began to groan and turn without me ever engaging the mechanism. The giant glass beehive started to rotate with a rhythmic click and whir while the beam of light swung out through the glass. The moment it passed through those red-tinted prisms, the light transformed into a crimson spear that stabbed into the night like a laser made of blood. I stumbled back and shielded my eyes from the heat, but the sound was what truly broke my composure because the flame was not crackling or hissing. It was instead whispering in a low, sibilant voice that sounded like it was saying that it could see over and over again from the center of the fire. I scrambled down the ladder back into the service room with my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I wrapped a bandage around my hand while trying to convince myself that it was just a strange chemical reaction. I told myself the fuel was a volatile compound and my blood was nothing more than a random catalyst that triggered the ignition. I sat on my cot and listened to the heavy thump of the lens rotating above my head while the room was bathed in a rhythmic and sickening red glow every time the light swept past the window. Even when I closed my eyes, I could feel the light searching the depths of the ocean like a hook being dragged across the seabed looking for something to pull into the air. Around midnight, the wind shifted and the storm Mr. O'Malley had feared finally arrived, with rain hitting the iron tower like lead bullets and thunder that made the very foundations of the rock tremble. Through the noise of the tempest, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice because someone was knocking on the steel door at the base of the tower 144 steps below me. The knocking was steady and heavy and rhythmic before the sound changed to a horrific scratching, as if something made of bone or rusted metal was being dragged across the surface of the door. Then, a wet, gurgling voice that sounded like it was full of salt water drifted up the central column of the stairs, calling my name Arthur and telling me that the light had summoned them for the inspection. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the stove and stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness. The sound of the heavy deadbolt I had locked myself began to slide back with a screeching metallic cry before the door creaked open to let in the smell of rotting kelp and dead things from the bottom of the world. Then the footsteps began, wet and heavy slaps against the iron steps as they began the long climb up to find me in the red light. The Glass Eye of Widow's Rock. Part 2. The Red Tide. There are 144 steps in the Widow's Rock Lighthouse. I know this because I counted them on the way up, and I counted them to keep my mind sharp while the isolation began to settle into my bones. I counted them to keep the panic away from the edges of my consciousness, but now something else was counting them as well. Slap, clang, drag. The sound was unmistakable and terrifyingly rhythmic. I stood at the top of the spiral staircase, peering over the railing into the absolute abyss of the tower shaft. The darkness below was a solid weight, but the acoustics of the stone cylinder were clear. The sound was wet and heavy, like a bag of sodden meat being hauled up the iron rungs of the ladder by something that did not possess the grace of a living man. I shouted into the dark to ask who was there, but my voice cracked and sounded pathetic against the roar of the storm outside. The climbing stopped for a long moment, leaving only the sound of the wind howling against the granite walls and the rhythmic thump of the great lens rotating above me. Then a voice drifted up from the dark, sounding closer than before, perhaps halfway up the tower. The voice bubbled as if the speaker had a throat filled with salt water, whispering that it was cold down there and that the water pressure squeezed the eyes and popped the eardrums, yet they could still see the light. I scrambled back from the railing in a fit of terror and retreated into the service room, slamming the heavy iron trapdoor shut and spinning the locking wheel until it would turn no further. I was trapped in the small circular chamber, and the only barrier between me and the stairwell was that single plate of iron. Above me, the lamp roared with a growing intensity, and the red light was getting brighter with every passing second. The service room was bathed in a bloody crimson glow every 5 seconds as the lens rotated, creating a strobe effect of flash and dark. I looked at the fuel gauge on the pipe leading to the lamp and realized that the situation was impossible. The single drop of blood I had spilled should have burned out in seconds, yet the gauge showed the tank was full and overflowing. The lamp was feeding on something far more potent than oil or kerosene, as it seemed to be drawing energy from the very idea of my blood and the sacrifice I'd accidentally made. Suddenly, a massive force slammed against the bottom of the trapdoor, making the iron floor plates shake beneath my boots. I screamed for them to go away while I grabbed the heavy iron poker, holding it like a weapon of last resort. The wheel of the hatch began to turn slowly, grinding against the rust with a screeching sound that set my teeth on edge. Whoever or whatever was on the other side possessed immense strength that defied the lock I had set from the inside. I ran to the window, which was caked with salt and grime, and scrubbed a circle clean with my sleeve to look out at the world I was leaving behind. The lightning flashed, illuminating the ocean below, and my knees gave out from the sheer horror of the sight. The ocean was not empty, for the red beam of the lighthouse was slicing through the water and penetrating deep beneath the surface to reveal thousands of pale, humanoid shapes floating just beneath the waves. They were all looking up with flat faces that lacked noses or ears, featuring only wide, gaping mouths and round, unblinking eyes that reflected the crimson light of the tower. Beneath those thousands of watchers, something much larger was moving through the depths. It was a shape as large as a whale, but it moved with the spindly limbs of a spider, reaching up from the continental shelf with appendages made of black coral and shadow to grasp at the rock foundation of the lighthouse. I realized then that the lighthouse was not a warning beacon to save ships, but was instead a dinner bell for something ancient and hungry. A sound of metal shearing snapped my attention back to the room as the trapdoor flew open and slammed against the floor with a deafening crash. A hand reached up to grip the rim of the hatch, but it was not a hand at all. It was a gray, bloated claw covered in barnacles, with fingernails replaced by sharp shards of black flint. The head followed the hand, and I recognized the man who had been the previous keeper. He was wearing the tattered remains of a uniform with a name tag that read Jacobs, barely visible through the slime and sea growth. He had jumped into the sea. Yet here he was, dripping with gallons of seawater that pooled on the floor while his neck remained bent at an unnatural angle. His jaw hung loose and disconnected, but his eyes were the most terrifying part of his visage. In their empty sockets, someone had shoved two jagged pieces of red sea glass that glowed with the same light as the lamp. He gurgled my name, claiming the inspection was mandatory, and the sound seemed to vibrate from his chest rather than his throat. I swung the iron poker with every ounce of my fear, striking his shoulder with a sound like hitting a bag of wet sand. He did not flinch or feel pain because there was no bone left to break. Jacobs reached out and grabbed my throat with a grip like a hydraulic press, cold and unyielding. He lifted me off the floor and pinned me against the wall, his red glass eyes inches from my face as the smell of deep pressure and rotting kelp filled my lungs. He whispered that I had lit the lamp and started the invitation, and now I was required to finish the meal. He explained that the Deep Father was blind in his dark trench and needed eyes to see his children, and that the Lighthouse provided that sight by using a soul as a filter for the beam. Jacobs claimed his own soul was used up and thin after 10 years of service, but that my blood was hot and my fear was delicious enough to power the eye for a new generation. He threw me across the room and I crashed into the ladder leading to the lantern room, feeling my ribs crack as I tasted the copper of my own blood. I scrambled up the ladder in a desperate bid for survival, entering the lantern room where the heat was blistering and the whispering of the flame had turned into a deafening scream. The fire seemed to demand that I see it and feed it until I became one with the light. I looked through the floor grate and saw Jacobs climbing the ladder with a slow and unstoppable gait, smiling with his broken jaw. My only escape was the outside gallery, so I threw the latch on the door and kicked it open into the teeth of the storm. The wind hit me like a physical blow, and the rain stung my face like needles as I stepped out onto the narrow walkway 100 feet above the jagged rocks. The ocean was boiling below as hundreds of those pale things began to crawl up the granite face of the rock like ants. Jacob stepped out onto the walkway behind me, unaffected by the gale, and told me there was nowhere left to go. He gave me the choice to jump and join the chorus, or stay and become the lens itself. As I backed away, my heel caught on a loose grating and I stumbled, grabbing the lightning rod for support. In a flash of lightning, I saw that the red beam was not just shining on the creatures, but was actually connected to them by threads of light that looked like puppet strings. The lighthouse was controlling the horde, and the strings all led back to the center of the flame. I realized I could not kill what was already dead, but I could kill the eye that directed them. I raised the poker to shatter the glass panels of the lantern room, but a cold and barbed tentacle shot out from the storm and wrapped around my waist. I was lifted off my feet and dangled over the edge, staring down into a single massive eye the size of a carriage that had broken the surface of the water. Behind me, the flame of the lamp flared and reached out like a hand of fire to pull me into the center of the crimson light. The Glass Eye of Widow's Rock. Part 3. The Human Wick. I hung there, suspended between the fury of the storm and the silent terror of the sea, while the tentacle wrapped around my waist felt like a band of freezing iron that intended to snap my spine. It squeezed the air from my lungs, rib by agonizing rib, until I could feel the very breath of life beginning to flutter in my throat like a dying bird. Below my dangling feet, the ocean was no longer a collection of waves or water, but had transformed into a single, colossal eye staring up from the infinite abyss. The pupil was a vertical slit of absolute blackness surrounded by an iris of churning, bioluminescent green that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of an ancient and cold heart. It was the Deep Father, a god of the trenches that had been forgotten by time, and he was undeniably hungry for the spark of life that remained within me. On the narrow walkway beside me, the dead keeper Jacobs laughed with a wet, gurgling sound that was immediately torn away by the screaming wind. He told me to let go and questioned why I fought the gravity, claiming that the water offered a kind of peace and silence that the world of the living could never understand. I looked down at the massive eye and felt the psychic weight of it pulling at my mind, trying to drag the memories out of my head and drink my sanity until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. But behind me, the lighthouse was screaming in its own way, for the fire in the lantern room had grown wild and untamed. With the glass panels shattered by my strikes, the gale was feeding the flames until they roared louder than the thunder itself. The red beam was thrashing wildly across the sky like a wounded animal, and I realized that the fire was a living thing that was intensely jealous of the ocean. It did not want the Deep Father to have me, and it did not want the water to claim its prize. I looked at my hand where the bandage had unraveled in the struggle, seeing that the wound was open and bleeding freely once more. The blood was not falling down into the sea as gravity commanded, but was instead floating upward in tiny red droplets that were sucked toward the lantern room. They were being drawn into the vortex of the flame as if the light were drinking from my veins. I realized then what the true nature of the contract had been from the very start. The lighthouse did not just need oil or mechanical repairs, for it was a beacon that required a host to anchor it to this physical world. Without a body to act as a conduit, the ocean would eventually rise up and swallow the tower whole, extinguishing the light forever. I was faced with a choice that no man should ever have to make. I could die wet and cold, drowned and eaten by the god in the trench, or I could die burning and consumed by the star in the tower. I looked at the ruin of Jacob's and whispered that I hated the water with a conviction that burned as hot as the fire behind me. I swung my legs and used every bit of my remaining strength to kick off the railing with my heavy boots, using the momentum to swing my body backward toward the shattered window of the lantern room. The tentacle tightened in response, trying to pull me down into the depths, while the barbs dug deep into my flesh and tore at my skin. I screamed at the creature to let me go as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Zippo lighter I always carried with me. I flicked the lid open, but I did not try to burn the tentacle itself because the limb was far too wet and slick with seawater. Instead, I held the small flame to the stream of fuel that was leaking from the broken pipe near the doorway. It was the same fuel I had spilled when I first arrived, and the trail of dark liquid caught fire instantly. The flame raced along the floorboards like a hungry snake, traveling straight into the main reservoir tank at the base of the Great Lens. There was an explosion, but it was not a traditional blast of shrapnel and debris. It was an explosion of pure, blinding light that felt as if a sun had been born inside the tower. The reservoir detonated as the remaining fuel vaporized in a millisecond, and the force of the blast blew the tentacle apart into steam and ash. I fell, but I did not fall down into the waiting mouth of the ocean. The blast wave threw me backward with such violence that I was slammed into the brass gears of the Great Lens. And then, the fire took me in its embrace. It did not burn my skin in the way a normal fire would, for it went inside my body through my mouth and my nose and my ears. It boiled my blood and turned my bones into something like charcoal, while every nerve ending in my body lit up like a white-hot filament. I opened my eyes to scream, but all I could see was a world of white light that erased the storm and the sea and the sky. The last thing I heard was the horrific shriek of the Deep Father as the superheated light seared its massive eye, causing the ocean to recoil and the waves to retreat in terror. The darkness fled from the rock, and then I was gone, lost in the heart of the Crimson Star. They found me 3 weeks later when Mr. O'Malley returned with the supply boat to check on the progress of the repairs. He found the lighthouse silent and the lantern room a total ruin of melted glass and twisted brass where the Great Lens had been utterly destroyed. He found me sitting in the service room, occupying the chair by the window as if I were waiting for a guest. I was alive, though the doctors at the mainland hospital were completely baffled by my condition. They said I should have been dead from exposure and the lack of food, and they noted that I had third-degree burns on 40% of my body. However, those burns had already healed into smooth and marble-like scars that felt cold to the touch. They asked me what had happened on that rock, and I simply told them that there had been a gas leak and a tragic accident. When they asked about the previous keeper, I told them he had been washed out to sea during the storm. They eventually discharged me after a month of observation, giving me a pair of dark and heavy sunglasses because I had developed a condition they called photophobia. They believed I had an extreme sensitivity to light, but they were wrong. I am not afraid of the light at all, for I have become the light. I live in a small cabin on the coast now, tucked away from the prying eyes of the town. I do not go out during the day when the sun is high because the natural world feels dim and gray to me. I wait for the sun to go down and for the shadows to grow long across the sand. I sit on my porch and face the ocean, listening to the waves crashing against the rocks miles away. I can hear the things swimming beneath the surface, and I know they are still there, waiting for the world to grow dark enough for them to return. But the monsters will not come near this stretch of the coast anymore, because when the night is at its darkest and the fog rolls in from the Atlantic, I take off my sunglasses and the darkness simply goes away. My eyes are no longer the blue they once were, for the organic parts are gone. In their place, two small and perfect spheres of red fire burn within my sockets. They do not blink and they do not fade, for they are fueled by a heart that no longer beats for itself. I am the wick, and I am the oil, and I am the warning that stands between the deep and the land. Sometimes, when the fog is so thick that ships might lose their way, I walk down to the edge of the beach and look out at the water. I open my eyes wide, and two beams of crimson light cut through the mist, stretching for miles across the horizon and burning the very surface of the sea. Deep down in the cold dark of the trenches, the monsters close their eyes and hide in the shadows. They know that the lighthouse did not fall that night on Widow's Rock. It simply found a way to move ashore. Part 1. The Silent Sentinels of the Valley of Death. The sun was a dying ember over the horizon of the Pennsylvania hills as Marcus Thorne hauled his tripod across the jagged labyrinth of Devil's Den. The air in Gettysburg did not behave like the air in other places. It was heavy and expectant, as if the atmosphere itself was a vast library of unrecorded screams. Marcus was a man who lived through the lens of a high-end digital camera, seeking the kind of shadows that history books failed to mention. He was not a believer in the campfire stories told by the local guides, but he was a believer in the texture of silence. At Devil's Den, the silence felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. The massive boulders were piled together in a chaotic jumble of ancient stone, looking like the bones of giants that had been bleached by the sun and scarred by the iron of 100,000 bullets. Marcus set his equipment on a flat rock overlooking the shallow stream known as Plum Run. History enthusiasts called this area the Valley of Death, and for good reason. In July of 1863, the water of this creek had run thick and dark with the blood of thousands. The Union and Confederate soldiers had fought a savage hand-to-hand struggle among these very rocks, and the bodies had been left to bloat under the scorching summer sun for days. Marcus adjusted his shutter speed and peered through the viewfinder. The light was perfect for capturing the deep violet hues of the dusk, but something was wrong with the focus. No matter how much he adjusted the lens, the center of the frame remained a blurred smudge of gray, as if a thumb was pressed against the glass. He wiped the lens with a microfiber cloth, but the smudge remained stubborn and cold. He clicked the first frame, and the electronic shutter sounded like a gunshot in the stillness of the park. When the image appeared on the digital screen, Marcus felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. In the background of the shot, standing between two split boulders, was a figure that should not have been there. It was a man with long matted hair and a tattered gray coat that seemed to blend into the granite. He was barefoot, and his feet were blackened as if they had been burned or frostbitten. He was not looking at the camera, but was staring down at the ground with an expression of profound and hollow exhaustion. Marcus looked up from his camera and scanned the rocks with his naked eyes, but the area was empty. There was only the wind whistling through the crevices and the distant call of a crow. He told himself it was a reenactor or a stray tourist, but the logic did not hold. The park had been closed for an hour, and there were no vehicles in the nearby lot. Marcus moved his tripod closer to the edge of the boulders, where the fighting had been most intense. He felt the temperature drop with every step he took toward the center of the den. The air began to smell of ozone and wet wool and something metallic that reminded him of a slaughterhouse. He aimed his camera again, and this time he saw three figures in the viewfinder. They were huddled together in a small depression in the earth. One was holding his side, and the black fluid of his life was leaking through his fingers. The others were looking at the sky with eyes that were nothing but white voids. They were not moving, but they were not still. They seemed to be vibrating at a frequency that made Marcus's teeth ache. He pressed the shutter again and again, as if the mechanical act of photography could protect him from the reality of what he was seeing. Each flash of the camera revealed a new horror. He saw a young boy, no older than 14, leaning against a rock with a wooden flute in his hands, but his mouth was sewn shut with heavy black thread. He saw a horse with its ribs exposed, standing in the middle of the creek, its eyes glowing with a dull and sickly green light. The landscape was no longer a national park, but a living wound in the side of the earth. Marcus realized that the rocks of Devil's Den were not just geological formations, but a massive storage device for the agony of the battle. The granite was porous, and it had absorbed the chemical signatures of terror and dying breath for 3 days in 1863, and now it was playing them back for him. The shadows began to detach themselves from the stones. They did not walk, but drifted like smoke against the wind. Marcus tried to pack his gear, but his hands were trembling so violently that he dropped his spare lens cap into a deep crevice. When he reached down to retrieve it, a hand that felt like dry parchment clamped onto his wrist. It was not a ghost in a white sheet, but a solid and freezing grip that possessed the strength of a vice. He looked down into the crevice and saw the face of the man from the first photograph. Up close, the man's skin was the color of a wet sidewalk, and his breath smelled of old earth and gunpowder. The soldier opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out except the dry rattle of a dead man's lungs. He pulled Marcus toward the dark opening between the rocks, and the camera fell from Marcus's other hand, shattering on the stone. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of gray uniforms and silver bayonets. Marcus felt himself being pulled back through the layers of time. The modern world was a thin veil that was being ripped away by the fingers of the dead. He heard the sudden and deafening roar of a cannon and the whistling of mini balls through the air. The silence of Gettysburg was gone, replaced by the cacophony of the bloodiest struggle in American history. He saw the smoke of the black powder rising like a wall between him and the parking lot where his car was parked. He was no longer a photographer documenting the past, but a witness who was being drafted into an eternal army. The man in the gray coat pulled him deeper into the den, and Marcus realized that the smudge in his lens had not been a flaw in the glass, but the shadow of his own future. Part 2. The Echoes of the Iron Storm. The transition was not a leap through time, but a violent immersion into a sea of noise and sulfur. Marcus Thorne felt the solid granite beneath his boots dissolve into a slurry of mud and gore as the silence of the modern park was annihilated by a sound so loud it felt like the sky was being torn in half. The air was no longer the cool breeze of a Pennsylvania evening, but a scorching wall of heat that tasted of charcoal and burnt meat. He tried to stand, but the sky above him was a ceiling of gray smoke through which the sun appeared as a pale and sickly disk. This was the second day of the battle, and Devil's Den was no longer a monument, but a slaughterhouse in full operation. The rocks he had just been photographing were now slick with fresh blood, and the air was filled with the rhythmic whistling of lead bullets that struck the stones with a sound like a hammer hitting a bell. He looked down at his own hands and saw that the digital camera was gone, replaced by a heavy iron musket that felt cold and oily against his palms. His modern hiking clothes had vanished, and he was now wearing a rough wool tunic that was stiff with salt and dirt. The man who had pulled him into the crevice was standing over him, and in the light of the midday sun, the soldier was no longer a translucent shadow. He was a boy of perhaps 19, with eyes that were bloodshot and frantic. He screamed something at Marcus, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of a nearby battery of cannons. The boy grabbed Marcus by the collar and shoved him against the base of a massive boulder just as a shell exploded in the clearing where Marcus had been standing only moments before. The ground shook with a force that rattled his teeth, and a shower of dirt and stone fragments rained down on his head. Marcus peered over the edge of his stone shelter and saw the Valley of Death in its true form. The area known as Plum Run was a bottleneck of human misery. Lines of men in blue uniforms were advancing through the tall grass, while the men in gray fired from the cover of the rocks. It was a chaotic and disjointed dance of death where no one seemed to have a clear view of the enemy. He saw a man 10 feet away from him stand up to reload his rifle, only to be knocked backward by a bullet that struck him in the center of the forehead with a sickening thud. The man did not scream, but fell like a sack of grain, his life extinguished in a heartbeat. Marcus felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized that this was not a vision or a dream. The pain in his shoulder where he had hit the rock was real, and the smell of the black powder was choking the life out of his lungs. The boy in the gray coat began to load his own rifle with a mechanical and terrifying speed. He shoved a paper cartridge into the barrel and rammed it home with a wooden rod, his hands moving in a blur of practiced muscle memory. He looked at Marcus and pointed toward the Union lines with a finger that was missing its tip. He was demanding that Marcus fight. Marcus shook his head and tried to crawl away, but the rocks seemed to be shifting and growing as if the den was a living maze that did not want him to leave. Every path he took led him back to the center of the fire. He saw the same scenes of agony repeating themselves in a loop of suffering. He saw the wounded crawling toward the creek for a drop of water, only to be crushed by the wheels of an ammunition wagon. He saw the dead being piled into heaps to create temporary barricades. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became unbearable. The smoke from the rifles created a thick fog that settled into the crevices of the den, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Marcus found himself huddled in a small cave-like space beneath a leaning boulder. He was not alone. 3 other soldiers were there, their faces blackened by powder and their spirits broken. One of them was singing a low and mournful hymn in a voice that was barely a whisper while he held a blood-soaked rag to his leg. The others were staring at the ceiling of the rock with the same wide-eyed void he had seen in his camera lens. Marcus realized that these men were the source of the hauntings. Their terror was so concentrated and their deaths so violent that they had left a permanent scar on the fabric of the location. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes that were forced to relive these final hours for eternity. Suddenly, the boy who had pulled him in fell into the cave, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time, his eyes seemed to clear. He recognized that Marcus did not belong to this time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph of a woman and a child. He pressed it into Marcus's hand, and his lips moved as he tried to speak a name. But before he could finish, a volley of fire erupted from the top of the rocks. The ceiling of their shelter was peppered with lead, and the boy was struck in the throat. He slumped against Marcus, his life's blood hot and wet against Marcus's chest. The black fluid was not the oil of a ghost, but the warm reality of a dying human being. The cave began to spin as the noise reached a crescendo. Marcus felt the weight of the granite pressing down on him as if the den was closing its mouth. He clutched the photograph to his chest and closed his eyes, praying for the silence of the modern world to return. He heard the sound of 1,000 voices screaming for mother and for mercy, and then a sudden and terrifying vacuum of sound. When he opened his eyes, the smoke was gone and the heat had vanished. He was lying on his back on the cold rocks of Devil's Den, and the moon was high in the sky. His camera lay shattered next to him, but his hand was still tightly closed. He opened his palm and found not a digital memory card, but a small, crumpled piece of paper that was yellowed with age and stained with a single drop of dark blood. The boy was gone, but the weight of his story was now a part of Marcus's own flesh. Part 3. The Debt of the Granite Graves. The moonlight over Gettysburg was a cold and indifferent silver, but for Marcus Thorne, it felt like the harsh light of an interrogation room. He stood trembling in the center of Devil's Den with the shattered remains of his career scattered at his feet. The silence had returned, but it was no longer the empty quiet of a park. It was a predatory silence that felt like a predator crouching in the darkness just out of sight. He looked down at his hand and saw the crumpled photograph of the woman and the child. The paper was brittle and felt like it might dissolve into dust if he breathed too hard, but the image was clear. The woman had a stern but loving face, and the child held a wooden hoop. They were a family from a century that had been erased by the wind, and yet here they were, held in his modern palm. Marcus tried to move toward the path that led back to his car, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Every time he took a step, the rocks around him seemed to rearrange themselves in his peripheral vision. The labyrinth was no longer static. He turned a corner, expecting to see the trail, but instead, he found himself staring into the same dark crevice where he had first seen the barefoot soldier. The air began to vibrate again with that low and agonizing frequency. He heard the sound of 1,000 dry leaves skittering across the stone, but there were no trees nearby. It was the sound of the dead moving. They were coming for the photograph. To them, that scrap of paper was the only thing that tied them to their humanity, and they could not let a living man carry it out of their domain. He saw the first shadow emerge from behind a boulder. It was the boy with the sewn-shut mouth. He crawled across the rocks with a disjointed and insect-like motion, his eyes fixed on Marcus's hand. Behind him came the others, the men with the white voids for eyes and the horse with the glowing ribs. They did not speak, but the air was filled with a collective psychic scream that demanded the return of their memory. Marcus realized that if he left the den with the photograph, he would be pursued for the rest of his life. The entities were not bound to the rocks by choice, but by the things they had lost. By taking the picture, he had taken a piece of their soul, and the debt had to be paid in full. He ran. He scrambled over the jagged edges of the granite, ignoring the sharp pain as the stones sliced into his palms. He could hear the heavy thud of boots behind him, even though the rocks were empty. He reached the edge of the den where the grass of the Valley of Death began, but an invisible wall seemed to stop him. The air was thick and gelatinous, as if he were trying to run through water. He looked back and saw the boy in the gray coat standing on the highest peak of the den. The boy's throat was still open, and the black fluid was still dripping down his tunic, but his expression was no longer one of exhaustion. It was one of pure and unadulterated hunger. He pointed a finger at Marcus, and the other spirits began to close the circle. Marcus looked at the photograph one last time. He saw the hope in the woman's eyes and realized that the boy had given it to him, not to keep, but to save. But there was no saving the dead in a place like Gettysburg. The ground was too saturated with blood to ever truly be clean, and the rocks were too old to ever forget. He understood that the only way to escape the den was to give back what belonged to the shadows. With a heavy heart, Marcus knelt on the cold stone and placed the photograph back into the deep crevice where he had found it. He pushed it deep into the darkness until it was swallowed by the shadows of the earth. The moment the paper left his hand, the pressure in the air vanished, the vibration in his teeth stopped, and the temperature rose back to the humid warmth of a Pennsylvania summer night. The shadows receded into the cracks of the boulders, and the sounds of the phantom battle faded into the rustle of the wind. Marcus stood up and walked toward his car without looking back. He didn't care about his broken camera or his lost lenses. He only wanted to be away from the Valley of Death before the sun rose to reveal the scars of the land. When he reached his apartment in the city, he went straight to the bathroom to wash the mud and blood from his skin. He scrubbed his hands until they were raw, but when he looked in the mirror, he saw a faint smudge of gray in the center of his vision. He blinked, but it stayed there. He realized then that the camera hadn't been broken by the rocks. It had been broken by the truth. He walked to his desk and saw his digital backup drive humming on the table. He plugged it in and opened the files from his night at Devil's Den. Every single image was gone. In their place were thousands of files named with the dates of July 1863. He opened one and saw the faces of the soldiers he had met in the dark. They were no longer shadows, but clear and sharp and filled with a terrifying life. Marcus Thorne was no longer a photographer of landscapes. He was now the curator of a gallery that no one would ever be allowed to see. The ghosts of the den had let him go, but they had left their images in his mind and in his machines forever. The 13th Rule of Bodhi, Part 1. The Souvenir of Ash. The high desert of the Sierra Nevada was a landscape of unforgiving gold and jagged silence, a place where the sun did not merely shine, but acted as a slow-moving furnace that baked the memory out of the earth. In the center of this desolation sat Bodhi, California, a town frozen in a state of arrested decay. It was a place where time had suffered a sudden and violent cardiac arrest in the late 19th century. To the casual tourists who traveled the dusty road to the National Historic Site, Bodhi was a picturesque relic of the Wild West, a collection of sun-bleached saloons and leaning houses that offered a glimpse into a rugged past. However, beneath the layer of picturesque nostalgia lay a foundation of concentrated misery. The wind here didn't just blow. It carried the dry, rattling whispers of 10,000 miners who had traded their lungs for gold. The park rangers who lived among the ruins lived by a strict set of regulations to preserve the site, but there was one directive carved into the back of a hidden, leather-bound ledger in the ranger station known only as the 13th Rule. Nothing leaves Bodhi, not even the thoughts that entered it. Marcus Vance was a professional urban explorer and a popular skeptic who made a lucrative living debunking local superstitions on his digital platforms. He considered himself intellectually superior to the Bodhi curse, the widely circulated legend that anyone who took even a pebble, a shard of glass, or a rusted square nail from the town would be hunted by a string of catastrophic misfortunes. To Marcus, these stories were nothing more than a clever marketing tactic designed to prevent looting and keep the historic site intact. He had built a brand on being the man who stood in the dark and laughed at the shadows. On a dry, windless Tuesday in October, while the sun turned the surrounding sagebrush into brittle tinder, Marcus slipped away from the main tourpath, his boots kicking up a fine, gray powder that felt more like pulverized bone than desert soil. He entered the old apothecary shop, a building that smelled of dried herbs, oxidized iron, and the metallic tang of ancient medicines that had long ago evaporated into the wood. The interior was a sanctuary of shadows, where light struggled to penetrate the grime-coated windows. With a swift, practiced motion, Marcus slid a small, ornate glass bottle from a sagging wooden shelf into his jacket pocket. The glass was an iridescent purple, a chemical reaction to decades of intense desert radiation, and it felt unnaturally heavy, as if the bottle were filled with lead rather than air. The moment his fingers closed around the glass, he felt a sharp, static pop against his skin, a spark of energy that made his vision swim for a fraction of a second. He ignored it. Smiling at the trophy he had secured, he thought of the thousands of views his video would get when he returned the item in a month, proving that he was still alive and well. As Marcus walked back toward the parking lot, the silence of the town underwent a subtle but terrifying shift. It was no longer the empty quiet of an abandoned settlement. It was the pressurized silence of a held breath. The wind, which usually whistled through the gaps in the timber, died down completely, leaving the air stagnant and thick. He felt the weight of the purple bottle in his pocket begin to vibrate. It was a low-frequency hum, a subsonic pulse that seemed to resonate with the calcium in his teeth and the marrow in his bones. He ignored the sensation, attributing it to the vibration of his phone or the slight lightheadedness caused by the high altitude. He reached his modern, high-tech SUV and drove away, watching the skeletal remains of Bodhi disappear into a swirling cloud of dust in his rearview mirror. The disaster struck the moment he crossed the official park boundary. His vehicle did not simply stall, it suffered a total mechanical disintegration. The engine block groaned with a sound of twisting iron, and the modern electronics flickered and died as if struck by an EMP. Marcus stepped on the brakes, but the pedal hit the floor with no resistance. He managed to steer the heavy machine onto the shoulder of the road, where the tires began to melt into the asphalt like black wax, despite the cooling evening air. Marcus climbed out of the wreckage, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal. He reached for his phone to call for roadside assistance, but the screen was covered in a thick, impossible layer of gray desert dust that appeared to be inside the glass, obscuring the digital display. He reached into his pocket to discard the purple bottle, desperate to rid himself of the catalyst for this madness. But his fingers did not meet the smooth surface of glass. They touched something cold, fibrous, and porous. He pulled the object out and recoiled in horror. The iridescent purple bottle had transformed into a piece of petrified human bone, a fragment of a jawbone with 3 yellowed teeth still embedded in the socket. It was still unnaturally warm, pulsing with a faint internal heat. The 13th rule was not a suggestion or a myth, it was a physical law of gravity. The town of Bodhi was no longer behind him, it was moving into his biological system. He looked at his reflection in the dead side mirror and saw that his eyes were clouded with the same gray dust. The desert was starting to claim the space where his shadow used to be, and the road back to civilization had vanished into a horizon of shifting ash. He realized, with a sudden, bone-chilling clarity, that the bottle hadn't been an object. It was an invitation, and the host was already standing behind him in the middle of the road. Part 2. The Marshal of the Empty Streets. The walk back toward the town limits was a descent into a waking nightmare where the laws of physics had been rewritten by the hands of the dead. Every time Marcus tried to walk toward the main highway, the road seemed to stretch and warp, the asphalt turning into a river of gray silt that pulled him back toward the center of Bodhi. The sun refused to dip below the horizon, hanging like a scorched, unblinking copper plate over the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada. It provided no warmth, only a dry, abrasive heat that felt like it was drinking the moisture directly from his blood. Marcus checked his pulse and felt a terrifying sensation. His heartbeat was no longer a fluid thud, but a dry, scraping rattle, like a handful of gravel being shaken in a wooden box. The dust he had seen inside his phone was now appearing under his own skin, forming gray, branch-like patterns that traced the path of his veins. As he crossed the threshold back into the town proper, the atmosphere shifted from stagnant to predatory. The abandoned buildings, which had looked so fragile and leaning during the day, now seemed to have straightened their spines, their windows reflecting a light that did not come from the sky. He saw a figure standing in the middle of Main Street, a tall man in a tattered duster coat that trailed in the dirt like the wings of a vulture. This was the Marshal of Dead Man's Gulch, the spectral lawman whose sole purpose was to enforce the 13th rule. He had no face, only a shifting vortex of sand and shadow beneath the brim of a wide, sweat-stained hat. In his right hand, he carried a heavy iron mallet, and in his left, a rusted set of shackles that didn't clink but moaned. Marcus tried to turn and run, but the dust on the ground rose up in rhythmic, sentient waves, coiling around his ankles like gray shackles made of bone meal. Every time he exhaled, the desert air stripped a layer of life from his body, leaving his throat raw and his tongue feeling like a piece of sun-bleached leather. His skin began to crack in geometric patterns, turning the color of the weathered timber that made up the town's saloons. He realized with a jolt of primal terror that the curse was not a streak of bad luck. It was a process of biological reclamation. The town of Bodhi was a closed circuit of matter, a zero-sum environment where every atom was accounted for. By taking the bottle, he had created a deficit in the town's inventory, a hole in reality that could only be plugged with his own physical essence. He stumbled toward the apothecary shop, his movements stiff and jerky, as if his joints were being replaced by rusted hinges. He intended to place the jawbone bottle back on the shelf and plead for his life, but the interior of the shop had transformed into something far more sinister. The shelves were no longer empty or dusty. They were filled with thousands of glass jars, each containing a terrifying piece of a former visitor who had dared to steal a souvenir. He saw jars containing locks of human hair that still twitched, wedding rings still attached to severed, mummified fingers, and even a jar filled with human breath that fogged the glass in a constant cycle of panic. These were the returned items of those who had tried to cheat the 13th rule. The marshal stood in the doorway, blocking the only exit, the sound of his breathing like the sliding of a shovel through dry earth. Marcus placed the petrified bone on the shelf, but the weight in his soul did not lift. It grew heavier, pressing him down toward the floorboards. The marshal stepped forward, the sound of his boots on the wood sounding like the closing of a lead coffin lid. He pointed a long, skeletal finger toward Marcus's own chest. The bone was not enough to satisfy the debt because Marcus had committed the ultimate sin. He had looked at the past and seen only a commodity to be exploited for fame. The bottle he had stolen had been the vial of last sighs, a vessel used by the town's doctor to collect the final breaths of the miners dying of silicosis. Since Marcus had touched it with the intent to possess it, those thousands of final, gasping breaths were now fighting for space inside his own lungs. The room began to spin as the gray dust filled Marcus's chest, turning his internal organs into dry, brittle parchment. He saw a vision of the men who had died in the mines, their faces gaunt and their eyes wide with the terror of a slow suffocation. He felt their thirst, their loneliness, and the agonizing weight of the earth pressing down on them. He was no longer Marcus Vance, the urban explorer. He was a living archive for a collective tragedy that had been waiting for a body to occupy. The marshal's faceless head tilted, and for a second, Marcus saw his own features, his eyes, his mouth, his nose reflected in the swirling sand of the lawman's face. The 13th rule was finally clear. To leave Bodhi, you must leave behind everything you are, turning your life into a permanent addition to the town's collection of ghosts. He felt his identity slipping away, replaced by the dry, relentless hunger of the high desert. Part 3. The Last Resident. The moon finally rose over the Sierra Nevada, but it was not the moon Marcus remembered from the world of the living. It was a cold, black sun, a void in the sky that cast no light, only deeper, more sentient shadows that moved across the salt flats with a predatory intelligence. Marcus sat on the floor of the apothecary shop, his body now as brittle as the ancient glass he had once coveted. He could no longer feel his legs. They had merged with the floorboards, the grain of the weathered wood growing through his skin in a slow, agonizing stitch. He was becoming a permanent fixture of the town's architecture, a new piece of arrested decay for the next generation of tourists to photograph and admire. He watched through the dusty window as the marshal patrolled the empty streets, the lawman's duster coat snapping in a wind that only the dead could feel. He realized then that the Bodhi curse was not a punishment, but a biological necessity for the town's survival. Without the periodic infusion of new souls and fresh matter, the desert would have reclaimed the buildings decades ago, turning the timber to dust and the glass to sand. The town was a parasitic entity that needed the energy of the living to maintain its grip on the physical world. Marcus Vance was the newest battery, a fresh source of memory and flesh to keep the timber from rotting and the glass from shattering. He watched his own hands turn into a pale gray wood, his fingernails falling off like flakes of old lead-based paint. He wanted to scream, to warn the world that Bodhi was not a museum but a trap, but his voice was now just the sound of the wind whistling through a knothole in the wall. He was the secret of the apothecary, the living evidence of the 13th rule. As the first light of a false dawn touched the town, Marcus felt his consciousness fragmenting. His memories of the city, his career, and his life were being filed away into the apothecary jars. He was being hollowed out to make room for the town's collective history. He felt the cold weight of the iridescent bottle returning to his wooden palm, but it no longer felt like a souvenir. It felt like a part of his own anatomy. The marshal stood over him one last time, tipping his hat in a gesture of grim welcome. The debt was paid, the vacancy filled. Marcus's eyes, once bright with the fire of a skeptic, were now two dull purple glass spheres, staring out at the empty street with a permanent expression of hollowed-out shock. The next morning, a park ranger found Marcus's SUV abandoned on the road near the park entrance. The vehicle was a total loss. The metal was rusted through as if it had been exposed to a century of acid rain, and the interior was filled to the ceiling with fine gray dust. There was no sign of the driver, only a set of barefoot tracks that led back toward the town and then simply dissolved into the sagebrush. Inside the glove compartment, the ranger found a small, ornate glass bottle of an iridescent purple hue. The ranger, a veteran who had seen this exact sequence of events play out many times before, did not touch the glass with his bare skin. He used a pair of long-handled tongs to carry the bottle back to the apothecary shop. He placed it on the shelf in its original spot, exactly where Marcus had found it. As he did, he noticed a new addition to the shop's interior, a life-sized wooden figure sitting in the corner, its face carved with an expression of such profound and realistic terror that it made the ranger's blood run cold. The mannequin's eyes, made of the same iridescent purple glass as the bottle, seemed to follow the ranger as he backed out of the shop and locked the door. Marcus wanted to reach out, to beg the ranger to burn the building down, but he was frozen in his wooden prison. He was the new guardian of the apothecary, a sentinel of the silent dust. He watched the tourists walk by throughout the day, their cameras clicking and their voices filled with the excitement of a day trip. He waited, with a hunger he could no longer explain, for one of them to reach for a rusted nail or a piece of weathered glass. He needed someone to take his place, to inherit the memory of the dead and the weight of the bone. Bodhi remained in its state of arrested decay, a beautiful and terrifying monument to the greed of the past and the hunger of the earth. But beneath the surface, the town was growing, one soul at a time, its foundations reinforced by the lives of those who thought they could take a piece of history without giving themselves in return. The dust continued to settle, covering the truth in a layer of gray, silent amnesia. Marcus Vance was gone, his digital footprint erased by a town that didn't believe in the future. The 13th rule remained absolute, and as the desert sun rose to bake the earth once more, the shadow of the new mannequin lengthened, reaching out across the floorboards like a hand, waiting for the next visitor to cross the threshold and make the same fatal mistake.